Our next guest writes that Jared Kushner waged a war against him behind his back, lining up allies at the highest levels of the Trump campaign and in front of the future president himself, at one point saying that his father, Charles Kushner, never should have been prosecuted, that the family and the rabbis could have dealt with it. It was a criminal conspiracy that involved escorts, sex tapes, and blackmail. And anyone who knew the U.S. attorney from New Jersey would have known that the family and the rabbis were not going to cut it. Former Governor Chris Christie, author of the new book, Let Me Finish, Trump, the Kushners, Bannon, New Jersey, and the Power of In-Your-Face Politics, joins me now. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Jared Kushner, how's he feel about the book?
I haven't spoken to him yet. But listen, as you see from reading the book, I just tell the stories. I mean, I experienced a lot over this period of time, and I kept quiet about it. Continued to help the president because he's been my friend for 17 years, and I have great affection for him. But people have to stand up and be accountable for what they did. And this book, if I was going to write a memoir, and I wanted to, it has to include that stuff where it's not going to be honest. And I think, you haven't heard anybody say anything about the book yet because it's an honest book.
So let me be honest. You savaged Jared Kushner, and he deserves it. But you don't lay a glove on Donald Trump, who empowered and empowers Jared Kushner today.
I don't think that's exactly accurate, because I say in there that the president has real weaknesses. I say in there that the president surrounded himself with grifters and convicted and unconvicted felons. I mean, I think that's pretty direct stuff. Now, I also do what a lot of these other books don't do, which is I point out his strengths. And I know him in a way that other people don't know him, because I've known him for 17 years. And so I've had a lot of personal time with him where I've gotten to see him as a father and talk to him about fatherhood. And I put that in the book. I talk about his sense of humor and the fun that we had, myself, Mary Pat, he and Melania, socializing together over the last 15 years. So what I'm trying to give a portrait of when I talk about the president in this book is the total person, not just the political actor, not the apprentice host, but the guy that I went out to dinner with, the guy that I went out to lunch with, the guy that I got to know over the last 17 years. You
were right about Jared Kushner, who NBC News reported on Friday. His security clearance was, the intelligence community tried to block it. Do you know what that's about?
I don't. No one, most of the time, I have a lot of great friends at the White House, including the president, but most of them never spoke to me about Jared.
What sort of ongoing problems could Jared have if his security clearance was blocked and somebody cleared it anyway? Only Abbe Lowell, his defense attorney, who he upgraded to after Jamie Gorelick sort of had done all she could do, Abbe Lowell, a criminal defense attorney. What sort of ongoing problems could Jared face?
Well, I mean, listen, I think that, it's why were the intelligence folks overruled? Who overruled the intelligence folks? We know that the president has the absolute right to do that if he wants to. He can grant security clearances to whomever he wants, regardless of the opinion of the intelligence community. So I don't know if the president did it or how the exact operation worked. We know that General Kelly had concerns about this, and as a result, not just with Jared, but with other people, ended the idea of temporary clearances. So I don't know. I don't think that in the end this is going to be anything that's debilitating to his ability to continue to advise the president, because the president wants to be advised by Jared.
Let's talk a little bit about Jared's tenure. On the campaign, he aligned himself with Paul Manafort, now awaiting sentencing, and he overruled your decision to really oust Mike Flynn from senior national security positions. You'd been warned by President Obama, and you had your own concerns about Mike Flynn.
I did. Listen, Mike Flynn, from the time I met him, was a train wreck. And I say that in the book very plainly. I had met him a few times, and then we went to a intelligence briefing as the two staffers to the then candidate Trump. And he was outrageous in that briefing, interrupting, demeaning, and just showing off in a way that was just immature and ill-tempered. And he left separately after that meeting, and I spoke to Donald for a while about this, and I just said, this is not a guy who you can give a senior position to. I know he supported you, I know you like him, but he's just not temperamentally fit to do this. And this was one of about a half a dozen conversations I had with the president, between June or July of 2016 and Election Day, about Mike Flynn, including up to and including the day after Election Day, when I saw the president for the last time before I was fired as transition chairman, where I said to him, this is a big mistake if you do this with Flynn. He told me he was doing it, and he said, you just don't like him. And I said, you're right, I don't like him. You want to know why? And he said, yes. And I said, because he's going to get you in trouble.
And he is going to jail in part for lying about his conversations with Russian diplomats, Sergei Kislyak, about sanctions. Jeff Sessions, who you're also pretty hard on in the book, lied about his contacts with Russian diplomats. Paul Manafort lied about all manner of things, but a lot of his book of dirty business was favorable to Russia. I don't know of anybody in the president's orbit who lied to who lied about contacts with any other country. Take away your 17-year friendship with Donald Trump, and why would so many people tell so many lies about Russia?
Well, what I'll tell you is what I said to someone earlier today. In my experience, bad people and stupid people lie all the time for no reason at all, because that's just who they are. And if you look at this list of people,
Jeff Sessions is bad and stupid?
Well, I don't think Jeff was bright enough to be in the position where he is.
So just stupid but not bad?
No, I don't think he's a bad person. I like Jeff on a personal level. I really do.
Do you think he lied about conversations with Kislyak out of stupidity?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. And I think...
And it happens to be the same lie told by Mike Flynn, Paul Manafort, George Papadopoulos, and everyone else that's been charged by Mueller?
Listen, and we don't know the bottom of this yet, okay? We don't know what else Bob Mueller is going to uncover. But I'm just telling you that I think there's another consistent strain to consider in addition to Russia, and that is that sometimes dumb and bad people lie. And I couldn't tell you, Nicole, how many times when I was U.S. attorney, I would see people come in and lie over stuff that just was ridiculous. Why lie about this? There was no logical thing.
I don't disagree with that, but these weren't random lies. These weren't dumb liars lying about all sorts of. It's not like one lied about Venezuela and another lied about Saudi Arabia. They all lied about Russia.
Well, let's explore another potential theory on this, as long as we're going down this road. You know, I think a lot of them, and this is the dumb part, maybe thought that what they were doing was inappropriate when it really wasn't. Having conversations with Kislyak and even having conversations with Kislyak about sanctions was not illegal at the time they did it.
Exactly. So why lie about it?
Well, you know, but if you think it might be, right? If you're getting questioned,
no way he didn't know the lies. He was the national security advisor.
No, if you think that it might be illegal, you might lie about it. You know what I'm saying? If you don't know the law, you don't understand the law, and now you're all of a sudden being questioned by FBI agents, that makes you think immediately, I must have done something wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have talked about that. And he lied to Mike Pence about it too. Why lie to Mike Pence? You know, I mean, there's somebody who's the #2 person in the country. So that's why I understand your theory, and you might turn out to be right.
It's not a theory. I read the newspaper.
Well, no, but
I mean, 19 people have been charged for lying about their contacts with Russia.
It's a theory that those lies are because something is connecting all the Russian stuff. And I just don't know that. So as a prosecutor, I always try to be really careful. I used to tell my folks all the time when they would come in and present a case to me, and I would start pushing back on them. They'd say, oh, come on, boss, you know he's guilty. And I'd say, yeah, no, I don't. What I care about is not what I know, it's what I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
So it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Cohen is both bad and stupid. Is that fair enough?
I would say that's pretty clear.
What do you think of the office, the Southern District of New York? Good office?
Aggressive office, great lawyers. I will tell you as a New Jersey guy that we often had conflicts with the Southern District because we called them, as most other offices call them, the Sovereign District of New York, because they believe that they're in charge of the entire Justice Department.
I worked in the White House where the president that we both work for appointed. You were known as both those things, aggressive as well.
Yeah. So I'm not saying, listen, but I don't want to give like the complete, like, you know, wet kiss to the Southern District of New York.
Well, you don't have to kiss them.
But what I'm saying, but let me finish before you try to nail me on this. I have absolute confidence in the fact that, you know, the overwhelming majority of people in that office do a very good job, very credible job. And I know the guy who runs the FBI, is the ADIC, as they call them, who runs the New York office. He was a corruption investigator for me in New Jersey when I was U.S. attorney. Yes, and he did a great job for me. And I think he's a guy of great integrity. So with him leading the investigations in the Southern District of New York and a lot of the good people in Southern, I'm pretty confident. And I've said it right from the beginning. And I think even when I was governor and I would come on this show, that I think that the Mueller investigation is not the president's biggest problem, and that the Southern District of New York investigation has always been much more dangerous and had much more hazard to it than does the Mueller investigation.
So the Southern District, I mean, I asked you what you thought of the office because the Southern District of New York has sponsored an allegation about the president. They allege that individual one directed a hush money scheme that Michael Cohen executed. Do you accept that the president is accused of directing a hush money scheme?
Well, I accept he's accused. I don't know if he's guilty, but I accept he's accused. They wrote it, they put it in an indictment, so they've accused him of that. Now, what the import of that is, did he know what he was doing? Did he understand that what he was doing was illegal? There's a lot of different things to prove a crime there. But do I agree that he was accused? Yeah, you can't disagree.
Michael Cohen ran operations at the direction of the president, though. Take this case aside. I mean, you understand the Cohen-Trump relationship pretty well. You and I have talked about it.
Yeah, listen, Cohen was around for a long time.
Would Donald Trump have wanted to take someone like Cohen to the White House with him?
I don't know whether he would have wanted to or not, but what I will tell you is that somebody like Don McGahn would have never accepted him.
Did he try?
Don would have to talk about that. But in the end, what I'll tell you is that I know Don McGahn really well. And if you look at the quality of the lawyers that were in White House counsel's office under Don McGahn, they're amongst the best in the country. And I don't think Michael Cohen would fit that bill. I
don't disagree with any of that. But do you know if Donald Trump made an effort to? Did he say to Don McGahn, hey, I'd like to find a spot for Michael Cohen?
Listen, I'm sure. The answer is I don't know, because the president never said that to me. But what I will.
Did you hear it from Don McGahn?
Well, I don't talk about my conversations with Don. Don's an old friend and a Jersey guy. We have a Jersey bond that we don't talk about the conversations we have. But what I will tell you is that Don was amongst the most careful, smart lawyers I've met in my career. And what Don was trying to do his entire time at the White House was to make sure that the people I kind of talked about were either kept out of the White House or were controlled if they were in them. And that was a full-time job for him.
He didn't succeed, though. I mean, Mike Flynn came in and ran. He was the president's national security.
Well, he did get him out in 24 days.
And Jared Kushner outlasted Don McGahn.
Well, that's very true. But, the bottom line is Flynn was out in 24 days. And I do feel some sense of vindication over that, because not only was he not successful as national security advisor, he was the single biggest failure as national security advisor in modern American history.
We're going to have a break in which you can yell at me if it makes But I want to ask you one more question about Don McGahn.
Mr. Mello now in the private sector.
Don McGahn, we're in the same line of work,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
Don McGahn spent, as far as we know, at least 30 hours testifying to Robert Mueller. He found himself in the position that you might have found yourself in if you had accepted a job as White House Chief of Staff. Can you imagine going in to serve this president, ending up spending 30 hours testifying before Robert Mueller?
Not a good day. But I will tell you this. That was forced by the lousy legal advice that the president got to waive privilege as to the White House counsel. And I think it was dumb advice at the time. It put Don in the position where he had to give all that testimony. And it just was dumb advice from a C-grade legal team.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.